Alright guys, in this video we are going to go over voting. We're going to start with Arrow's impossibility theorem, then we're going to move on to political behavior, then we're going to talk about the median voter theorem, and finally we're going to finish up with the myth of the rational voter. So let's start with a story. Suppose you walk into an ice cream shop, seeing that they have chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla. You order chocolate. Before the vendor has a chance to scoop out the ice cream, she says, "Sorry, we're actually out of strawberry." And in this case, you choose to switch to vanilla. This would be strange, right? You just picked chocolate when you had all three options. Now that you only have two, you suddenly switch. A different time, you walk into the store. You decide you like sprinkles. So you walk into the ice cream shop, seeing that they have chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla. You again choose chocolate. But before the vendor has a chance to scoop out the ice cream, she says, "Actually, today, chocolate comes free with sprinkles." Again, you switch to vanilla. It should be pretty crazy, given that this isn't how a rational person would behave. A third time, you walk into the ice cream shop, and you're offered a arrangement of toppings. You can get sliced apples, sliced bananas, or sliced coconuts on your ice cream. You're offered first the apples and the coconuts. You choose the coconuts. You're offered the bananas or the coconuts. You choose bananas. But then you're offered apples and bananas, but you choose apples. In a minute, I'm going to show that that's irrational a little more clearly. What does this have to do with Arrow's impossibility theorem? Well, each of these examples in turn highlight one of the ways that Kenneth Arrow, an economist, showed that we cannot create a voting system that takes into account all the different voters' individual preferences and makes a consistent and sensible way to sort out votes. Let's go through these in turn. What did we learn by it being the story where we are out of strawberry? Well, Arrow says it should be the case that irrelevant alternatives, when presented, don't change the outcome of a vote. If you were given chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla as options, and you chose chocolate, taking away the option of strawberry shouldn't change you between chocolate and strawberry. And yet, we see many cases in politics where a third option, such as a third candidate, will change the way that the vote works out. A classic example, of course, we can't know in retrospect, but a classic example is Bush 1 versus Gore, where Bush 1 versus Clinton, where Clinton ended up winning because of the presence of the alternative option in Ross Perot. I'm not here to comment on whether or not that is actually what happened, but in general, we can see a situation where that would change how a vote works out. The second story tells us about the failure of positive association, right? Improving one option should not make it possible that that option ends up being lower in the rankings of the voting outcomes. And then finally, the transitive property. So if you have a situation where a set of beliefs, if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A should be greater than C. This is called transitivity. And what we can show is that when we're taking into account voting, it actually is the case that we can compare A to B and B to C and get two sets of results, but then compare C to A head to head and get a different result. This is called pairwise comparisons, and this gives us one of the most common problems observed in voting, and this is what's called cycling. When we're given different options in two different in a arrangements, two at a time, in a different order, that we get different outcomes. Of course, these paradoxes have been known for centuries, but Ken Arrow showed that it's not possible to make a decision mechanism it's not possible to make a decision mechanism that can eliminate all of those types of errors together, all of those paradoxes together. Okay, so as a quick aside, this applies to any ranking system. It's not just voting, but we can't take any group and create ranking. Now, Arrow is specifically talking about rankings here. So when we have a cardinal system, so it's not just we rank them without sort of any strength of signal, it's just rankings. So the sort of most general way to put this is that Arrow showed that group choice aggregation is not like individual choice. So when we try to put things together in a group and make collective decisions by voting, something like that, we don't end up with a situation that is like individual choice, which is does follow rationality. Okay. The big upshot, the major lesson, right? If we're going to put a star anywhere here early on, is this idea here. When a group chooses, Arrow shows that there are no underlying preferences to discover, even in theory, right? Arrow showed that when a group chooses, there are no underlying preferences to discover, not even in theory, right? We know that a group doesn't have preference in the same way that a group can't smile, group can't take collective action, right? We can do collective action as an authoritative representative of a group, but we understand that a group can't do things in the way that an individual can do. Now, what's important, though, is Arrow showed that without invoking sort of very specific cases, which we'll talk about in a second, we can't even rationalize group choices as if the group had preferences, right? The only group that rationalizes group choices would have to be an insane person and do things like we described with the ice cream scenario. Okay, so let's look at a little more formality here. Arrow's impossibility theorem. There's a couple different ways. The first thing I want to say here is, right, your theorem fundamentally is stating you can't rank in an electoral system. You can't create a system that will rank options in a way that satisfies those fairness criteria we were talking about, right? So, for example, if every voter in a group prefers X over Y, the group has to prefer X over Y. Second criteria is if every voter prefers X over Y and that doesn't change, then the group's preferences between X and Y doesn't change if all the voters do. And then finally, there's not a single voter that then can always determine the group's preferences. Arrow calls this a dictator. That's probably not really, it's not dictator in the way that you and I would think about dictator, because that could be an authority or it could just be somebody who has a lot of emergent power. But let's take a look at the formal statement of these things, go through them one by one. So there's non-dictatorship. Another way to say this is that set of preferences that we're thinking about among the voters should reflect multiple voters. And in fact, it should reflect all the different voters. It can't simply, right, we say we have three, right, this would be like a parent with their kids or something. We say there's a mother and two children, but the mother gets to say things. This isn't what we're studying. The second is what we call universality or an unrestricted domain, right? So you have to have a voting system, a social welfare function, right, that actually represents how society it determines it's better off, has to give us a complete set. We have to be able to completely create rankings, right? And we have to get the same rankings every time if the voters' preferences don't change. Okay, and then third, maybe the most famous and most popular one is this independence of irrelevant alternatives. Right? This is simply the idea that if you're comparing between X and Y, the only thing that should matter between those things are the individual preferences about X and Y. This is called pairwise independence. So if we change our rankings of things that aren't X and Y, it shouldn't change our choices between X and Y. Right? So if we're voting for X, Y, and Z, we get one outcome, and it's X or Y, and X or Y related to each other actually, and then we remove Z, we should still get the same relative ranking between X and Y. Okay, next is what we call monotonicity. This is a fancy word just for that idea about sprinkles, right? If you have an individual move something up in the rankings because they prefer it, the voting system should not end up ranking that lower. Right. So if nothing changes, but X just gets moved higher up in the ranking by one of the people in the voting, then it should be impossible. X might not go anywhere, but it should be impossible for it to go lower. Next is non-imposition, right? And so this is just saying this has to count all the votes equally. So we can create out of any, I guess this is not technically true, but it is intuitively right. You can take, if you have a large enough voting base, you can take any combination of individual preferences. You can get to any outcome you want if you arbitrarily exclude or combine, give higher weight to other outcomes, right? So we're just saying it has to be the case that we are counting all the votes, and we're counting all the votes in an equal way. And then finally, Pareto efficiency, which is pretty straightforward. If everybody prefers something, so must society, right? So if everybody likes something more, it should move up in the rankings. If everybody likes one thing to the exclusion of all the other things, then society should also like that relative to the other things. Okay, so what do other economists have to say about this? The first interesting thing is Duncan Black, who we've talked about in this class, made the comment when he discovered that cycling existed and was irrefutable mathematically, that this made him physically sick, right? Because it shows that we can't have a voting system. We can't design a system that meets all those fairness criteria and then gets all the outcomes we just discussed on the previous page, right? Which this seems counterintuitive to you because you think of these things as being fair, but economists have shown, as I'm showing you here, that turns out to not be the case. Okay, this is why cyclical majorities often explain why public opinion seems inconsistent, right? So you have voters that on one hand seem to support policies that are bad for jobs like minimum wage, and at the same time want to support other types of policies that seem to create jobs, right? You see lots of cases where governments do seemingly inconsistent things, where they vote one thing one way and then very shortly after vote another thing another way. Okay, and so it's important. This gets at that idea we talked about in a previous lecture, the public choice lecture, that talks about what makes up the political, air quotes, we, right? At best, that's a majority, but even as we're showing here, even if you think you're representing the majority, you may not be, and it may even contradict itself. More on this in the median voter theorem. Next is James Buchanan. So James Buchanan said, yes, cycling probably exists and it's a problem in theoretical situations, but this is actually better than when we have a continuous exploitation of the same minority. So if the minority is always losing and the majority is always winning, that tyranny of the majority idea that we talked about before, maybe cycling is actually better. Buchanan, of course, says even the idea of a social welfare function itself assumes that society is somehow independent and organic entity, which goes against what we learned in the last lecture about methodological individualism. Remember, the individual is the fundamental unit that makes decisions. The way Buchanan put this is the individual is the only entity that possesses ends or values. Right? Individuals make choices, so we want to be careful that we don't fall into, while we're talking about a voting function, making those collective mistakes that we made before. Gordon Tullock said cycling is rare in practice, and this might be true, might not be true, but he argues things like log rolling and omnibus bills, like we talked about in the last lecture, actually generate stable coalitions, and so you reduce the amount of cycling that's happened. So one of the things I didn't say but should have said earlier is Arrow's theorem says if you have two or more voters trying to vote for three or more options, you can't. So if we have obviously one voter, that's sort of an irrelevant position. But if we only have two options at all, then you can create a voting system that actually rank orders them and represents the preferences. Not that it automatically would, but you can. What Arrow's saying is something very strong. If you have at least 2 voters and at least 3 options, you cannot create a system that guarantees it will represent accurately and fairly the preferences of the individuals. Okay. As a counterpoint to Tulloch, then, the cycling might be somewhat rare in practice, but it's a big problem because it essentially ensures that there is arbitrary winning happening all the time. So even if there isn't cycling in the sense that we see one combination one time and another combination another time, and those are the same combinations being compared in the same way, and we get different results, this doesn't matter because it essentially shows that even if we don't go through the cycles, any one point of that cycle is still arbitrarily decided. And then finally, Nobel Prize winning economist, I guess James Buchanan also won a Nobel Prize, so I should have noted that earlier. But another Nobel Prize winning economist, F.A. Hayek, notes that there's no such thing as a we as society. That has no ascertainable meaning except to say the majority that imposes its will on other people. Okay, next I want to turn to political behavior, and I want to pose 3 questions and then draw some lessons out of that. The first question would simply be, given all the problems that we've discussed thus far, why would it be that individuals would seek their aims in the political sector rather than in markets? Should markets always be superior? Well, there are actually a few cases that would give some people the desire to work in political ways rather than markets. The first, obviously, is that political solutions can actually compel people, as we discussed before. It is important to remember that all government activity is predicated on violence, right? This is the idea of coercion. If you violate even the smallest of government rules, if you end up not getting away with it, you are caught, as it were, you will end up facing violence of one form or another, right? So this is obvious in some cases that are very high profile. If you murder somebody, you're not following the political will. In many states, you're going to end up being executed. But consider something like a speeding ticket. You get a speeding ticket, you don't comply, you get a fine, you don't pay the fine, they put a warrant out for your arrest, they put you in prison, right? This is another form of violence, which we obviously know because if an individual did that, we wouldn't call it imprisoning people, we would call it kidnapping. And again, I'm not advocating that it is invalid that the government be the one that has a monopoly on violence. We should just remember that any time we're using even the most innocuous political activities, remember that at the end of the day, if people are going to resist that political activity, they are facing violent solutions to that, right? So in a market, you have to convince, you have to woo, you have to make a good deal for somebody in order to get them to interact with you, in order to trade with you. In order for you to get better off, you have to make other people better off. Political solutions are not like that, right? So they do solve the financial free rider problem, right? Because if you've only got voluntary provision, then some goods, like we talked about in the public goods lecture early on in this semester, some people won't pay for things like national defense or other things that we talked about being public goods. And so you can have some things that you need to compel people in order to have. The second idea is that the market relies on 2 key institutions. These are property rights and contract enforcement. Those are things that the government has to uphold. They have to protect property rights, and they have to enforce contracts in situations where people are not upholding their end of the contract. So imperfections in your legal rights can only have political solutions. And then finally, political action can actually allow some to benefit at the expense of others. Markets can't do that, right? Because in the absence of very strong externalities. But in general, only political action, even in a democracy, notice, can allow one group to benefit at the expense of the rest of society or at the expense of other groups, right? So maybe gifts, unintended spillovers. There's a couple really narrow situations in free markets with protected property rights where those who pay are the ones who benefit, and then you get other such transfers. But political victories, however, have the opposite, right? People who and getting those political victories can extract benefits at the expense of other people, right? So if I go to the store, I give them some money, they give me a Snickers bar, I paid, I get the benefit. If I go to the store and I pay, and then you come along and seize my Snickers bar right before I can eat it, I paid and you benefited. Only a political process can do that. Okay, next question, or next sort of observation is there are some key problems and drawbacks to the political process, sort of even if somebody is wanting to pursue their goals in the political sphere. The first is that political solutions do not or may not last, right? One Congress, one legislature cannot bind the next. So a political solution, other than transferring things into the private sphere, can only last as long as the political system upholds that. Right, so many times we see political power shift back and forth, and the next party or next individual that holds an office will go about undoing many of the things that was done before. Right, so any political program can be reversed as political pressures end up changing. Maybe that's upside as well as it is downside. Another way to say this, there's no inter-period binding for law. Okay, next point is that innovation is very difficult to sell to the majority in a political setting, right? This is first because politicians and bureaucrats are very risk averse. They don't want to lose their job trying out something new and innovative when they can stay the course and keep their job, right? So, you have to get a majority agreement in Congress or legislature or open vote. Hard to do that with innovations. No, the market is the exact reverse of this because there's a first mover advantage. So innovation is pushed and innovation is pursued in a market because if you're the first person to take advantage of an innovation, if you're the first person to buy a new product, to create a new product, you get the benefit of that. You get more benefit of that, and sometimes even sort of exponential benefit from doing that. Finally, political activity has different consequences than market activity, right? So even though some people can benefit from political action that others take, they end up being bound by it and having to pay for all of those political outcomes, whether it's in their interest or not. Whereas in a market situation, if you pay for something, you pay for it only as long as it is in your benefit, and you only pay for things that are in your benefit. Say you get a bill from your internet provider tomorrow and they've doubled their prices. What do? You just go around the corner to the other internet provider. No such situation in a political situation. Okay. Third question is, or observations really, is that we've looked at those political benefits and costs, but we also have these predictable problems in political processes in addition to political outcomes. In addition to the arrows and possibility theorem, we also see that if you're only giving one vote to one citizen, you can't allow voters to show the intensity of their preferences. Consider an example. You and your two friends always go to lunch after class. The first day you decide just by a normal voting, right? And two people pick Chick-fil-A and one person picks McDonald's, right? And we say, okay, this is a good majority outcome and the most people are happy in that situation. But suppose that the next day you go and instead of just casting a secret ballot, you actually have a discussion. And the two people that choose Chick-fil-A are very marginal. McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, they're pretty close. I guess if I have to pick, if I'm forced to pick, I'll choose Chick-fil-A. And the third person stands up and gives an impassioned battle speech on why we should pick McDonald's. And they're done with this friend group if we don't eat McDonald's. Well, what's the best outcome? The best outcome in this situation is probably that the person who has very strong preferences should get their way here, even though there's two people who have very slight preference, right? They're not harmed very much by going to McDonald's. They're just slightly less happy. And the person who is very vocal about their preference for McDonald's, I should be careful. They have a very intense preference. They're benefiting from McDonald's a lot. They hate Chick-fil-A. They hate chicken products. We gotta eat McDonald's fries and burgers, they're benefiting a lot from not going through with it that way. So when you listen to that example, I want you to be careful because there's temptation to say, "Oh, that person's a bully," but that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there's genuine preference. There's like they actually feel that way. These are close friends. They were not lying. They're not gaming the system, which, by the way, is another problem with Arrow. Another problem that Arrow highlights, right, is you can have all these other set of problems in addition to cycling that comes along anytime you have multiple options, more than two options, because you can have gaming the system, right? I might want to vote for option 2 even though I prefer option 1 because I just really prefer avoiding option 3 and I think option 2 is more likely to win. It's another problem with voting. So in the political sphere, this intensity problem, in the intensity of your preferences really matters, right? If we have a few people who slightly prefer one thing and many people who dramatically prefer another thing, it might be better off for society that we get the thing that benefits people based on their actual amount of preference and not just the number of people that have one preference or another. Okay. The next is policy bundles, right? A voter has to sort of vote for a large bundle of policies and can't pick and choose, right? Candidates are a good example of this. They represent many things. And of course, you've probably never voted for somebody who you agreed with every single thing that they have listed on their policy stances, right? So you get a candidate, they're really a bundle of different ideas and issues, and you can't take you can't take some things from candidate A and some things from candidate B and some, right? So you get bundled together. In the marketplace, no such problem, right? You can end up picking and choosing. Sometimes when my wife and I travel, right, we like to go, it's time to stop for lunch. We might like to go and stop at a mall that has a food court, right? And then I can get Chick-fil-A, my wife can get McDonald's, and my children can go to Sonic, right? Can't do that if I have to pick just one restaurant and everybody sit and choose from there. Okay, next is your vote doesn't matter. Simple as that. The odds that an individual voter cast the decisive vote in an election are astronomically low, right? Even in the smallest elections, even in city elections, even with only a few hundred voters, your odds of casting the vote that decides the election is less than 1%. You know, at the national level, we have 60 million, 120 million votes typically on presidential elections. So your odds of being the vote that ends up deciding that are 1 in 60 million, 1 in 100 million, 1 in 120 million, right? So it is just the case that your vote is not important to democracy. I mean, this is mathematically irrefutable, right? The problem with this, or not problem, depending on how you think about it, right, is the cost of an uninformed or mistaken vote is zero because it won't actually go about affecting an election. We'll talk about this more as we move along, right? If you make a mistake with a purchase, you bear the full cost. You make a mistake with a vote, everybody bears the cost, and the odds of that affecting the election are very, very, very low for you as an individual. And this leads to what we call rational ignorance. Rational ignorance. More on this later, but it's tied to this idea that your votes don't matter. And then finally, politicians, when they go out of office, they have no more ties, no more stakes to what it is that they were doing. And so they have an incentive to provide current benefits while delaying the costs into the future. They have less incentive to invest today and more incentive to consume today, right? Future voters, they can't affect elections. They simply get what we leave them, right? Debts and assets both, right? Whereas in a private setting, think of your children. If you're going to leave an inheritance to them, you want to make decisions that actually include the future. And so the political system shortens the time horizon. Shortens the time horizons dramatically. Okay, so two lessons here, right? Two lessons here. Political activity is often seen as a way to solve problems that aren't handled well by markets, by the private sector, right? And this is everything from pollution to national defense to redistribution, right? And we probably all agree that private sector results in some of these areas or all of these areas are unsatisfactory, if not to us, then to other people. And those are probably fair complaints in certain situations. But the problem is, this gets us a growing political set of programs, both growing in size and number, aimed at sort of solving each of these goals. But it's often the case that a political solution can't even be reached, right? We just don't have the ability to get to those solutions based on all the problems that we've discussed. And even if we can, we're not going to be able to do so in a cost-effective way. It's going to be very costly in order to do that because we lack the cost-minimizing mechanism that markets give us. So we want to weigh the cost very carefully when introducing political solutions because of these issues raised by political behavior. Next, I want to turn to the median voter theorem. Okay, so put very simply, I'm taking this from Tyler Cowen and Alex DeBerrick's textbook. The definition of the median voter theorem is that when voters vote for the policy that is closest to their ideal point on a line, the ideal point of the median voter will beat any other policy in a majority rule election. Let me put that a little different way. The option closest to the median voter will win. Okay, so we're going to make an example here. I'm going to try to keep it nice and simple so that it's sort of straightforward and obvious to us. Assume you have one issue and there's a whole spectrum of results. We can have more spending or we can have less spending. We pick any number from 0 to our entire budget that we want to spend. And we have 5 voters. Okay, so we're keeping it simple here. And the Republican comes along and they say, this is how much spending. We're a little bit less spending. And the Democrat comes and says, here's where I'm gonna, how much spending I'm promising you. Okay, so how many votes does the Republican get? Well, the Republican gets all the votes that are close to him. Gets these 2 votes. A and B will vote for the Republican. And the Democrat comes along and they get 3 votes because they are closest to the opinion of all the individual, of those 3 individual voters, right? So if I'm E, I want a lot of spending. Well, yeah, D's pretty far away, but the Republican candidate's even further away. I'm going to give my vote to D, right? This is the median voter. So what I'm saying is whoever's closer to this median voter is the one that will end up getting the vote and win the election. When it happens, if the re-election campaign comes around and D is going to leave their policy where it is and the Republican candidate has to come along and set their new policy. Well, of course, we know that the second time that the Republican is going to jump and is going to move around, right? And there's lots of dynamics here, right? We could put, let's just say, let's do this as an example. Let's say the Republican just really goes crazy on the spending. And so now they put theirs way over there. Well, who votes for? Well, now the voter A will switch and voter B will switch. Voter D and E will obviously switch. But what does the median voter do? This is the median voter. Median voter, right, is C. What are they doing? Well, they're closer to R than they are to D. Now R will get these votes and will end up winning, right? We can imagine lots and lots of scenarios where, you know, the vote, right, in this case I've moved R over quite far, but we can imagine sort of marginal changes that will still lead to these situations. Just want to highlight that idea. Whoever is closest to the median voter is going to end up winning the election. This theorem, it seems simple, but it holds very strongly. We see lots of excellent cases that highlight this in reality. Okay, so let's draw a few things out. The first is that, as we just showed, the result of the median voter theorem is that policies tend to move towards the median. But the other thing that is interesting here is that the intensity that is happening in the extremes um, doesn't actually change the result because it is the median voter that's going to matter. So let's take a look here. Suppose one of the more extreme candidates, let's say A, because right, the Republican candidate is losing the way that I've drawn this one. Let's say A comes along and moves way out here and decides, I want even less spending, right? We've had all this spending because the Democrat is winning and C, D, and E are getting what they want and I'm not getting what I want. And I'm going to react by being even more sure that we should have less spending. Well, now let's recount the votes. If R and D don't move, C, D, and E still all voting for the Democrat. B is still voting for the Democrat. What is A going to do? The same thing that they were doing before. So even if these move out toward the extremes, right? Even if every single person moved toward the extreme, polarization, as you might hear in common society, if these aren't changing at the same time, the intensity of those extremes doesn't end up mattering. It's the median voter that's going to matter. So when we hear political analysis that's talking about, oh, there's more polarization and more extremes, right? It makes us think, well, if these guys are kind of moderate and then all of a sudden they become less moderate, there should be more support for this person. But that's not how voting works, right? We can't signal the intensity of our preferences. We only get one vote apiece, so it's just going to be where we are relative to these situations. Okay, next I want to take a look at The Myth of the Rational Voter. Myth of the Rational Voter is a book by Bryan Caplan. It's a very important idea and topic, and one that I want to sort of wrap up with in our voting video. So the question that Caplan asks is basically, look how little people know about policy issues, about candidates, etc. Does democracy work? How can it work? Well, if it's the case that these errors that people make, if they're random, it turns out that democracy can work because of what we call the miracle of aggregation. So the two classic examples in the economic literature of this are, suppose you go to a fair, there's a steer, and there's a contest to guess how much the steer weighs, and the closest wins. We get 1,000 guesses, and it's all manner of people who have no idea what a steer weighs. Well, it turns out the average guess will be very close, and when they've done this study, it's like plus or minus a pound. We're very close to the right answer. Now, what's up with that, right? Most of these people have no idea how much a steer weighs, right? You're gonna get silly answers like 100 pounds or like 100,000 pounds, which are gonna be way off and not even be close. Well, what's happening there is it's not everybody in there that's a fool, right? And there will be a set of people that actually do have an idea, and so the average guess might be very, very close, or likely will be very, very close. And the reason for this is there's a huge difference between being 100% uninformed as a group and being 99% uninformed as a group. What happens if two candidates are running and one candidate is just stereotypically evil? Well, this is a literal serial killer, just wants to take the whole country down, and the other person is your virtuous, upstanding individual that we would all vote for if we knew. And 100% of us are uninformed. We don't know A from B, right? We don't know anything about them. What's going to happen? Well, it's 50-50, right? It's just literally going to be a coin toss. Every vote's going to be a coin toss. The random error will drive everything. But what happens if just 99% of people are uninformed? Well, now there's 99% of people that are uninformed, and they will vote 50-50. That'll be 49.5 each way. But the 1% will do what? They'll vote for the virtuous, upstanding person. They won't vote for the serial killer. What happens? They're gonna get their 50.5% and win the election. So we have this miracle by which democracy can work, even if we know almost nothing. As an electorate, people that know, now knowing and preferences are different things, but just keep it simple at this point, just understanding bias and error. This works as long as the errors are random and they're not systematic. So for a moment, let's just look at this. Say we have no bias, and this actually is the optimal outcome. Well, lots of people are wrong over here. Lots of people are wrong over here, but there's a few people in the center that make it up. And when we average this out, we end up with the optimal outcome, right? We end up here. We end up at optimality. But if there's systematic errors, that introduces bias. Now there are people that are close to right. In this case, I've drawn those as way out in the tail. But even if these were off just a little, that would show. We have some people that are on either side of the bias, but we get a winning outcome that is different than the optimal outcome. So if there's systematic errors, right, guessing the steer, there aren't systematic errors. This is just random error. We just know or don't know. There's systematic errors. We actually get this potentially bad outcome with democracy. And this is because democracy is not a market, right? If you make a mistake in a market, you bear the cost individually. So you're very interested in getting that right. In politics, the collective bears the cost. And in fact, you effectively bear none of the cost because your vote on the margin is not going to end up determining the election. This brings us back around to rational ignorance. So it actually is rational to not know much about voting. This is because the odds of our vote deciding the election are basically zero. As Anthony Downs, who we've discussed already a little bit in this class, famously put early on in the field of public choice, one of his papers is one of the things that gave birth to the field of public choice in economics is, quote, "It is irrational to be politically well informed because the low returns from data simply do not justify their cost in time and resources." So suppose that you have an issue that comes before you that you're thinking about, I'm going to vote on, or the candidate I'm voting for, this is going to be the issue that I decide whether to vote for them or not. Now, oftentimes we have beliefs, right, that are going to want to inform those things, and it may be the case that those beliefs lead us to wrong conclusions. But in order to discover this, we have to spend lots of time studying the issue, right? How many times have you voted and gone in and you don't know all the candidates? You don't know, even if you do know all the candidates, you know all the things that they stand for. So it's very difficult to decide how to vote in that situation. It would take you hours of study, and you have many important things that you do in life, right? You're studying for classes, you're working at a job, you have family and friends and pets that need time, your time to spend with them, or some of you might have children or other dependents. It is very important that you spend time with those individuals. If you spend all your time studying so that you can be the most well-informed voter out there, you still only get one vote. That vote isn't going to decide the election. It is a very bad decision to be highly politically informed unless you get enjoyment from being politically informed that is unrelated to the outcome of the vote. So for me, as an economist, I'm very interested in what's happening in economics, but that's because I get benefit from understanding that, so I can talk about it in classes, talk about it with classmates. These are discussions I like to have. Other types of issues, I do not care as much to know or to discuss, so I'm rationally more ignorant on those issues than other issues. Some people don't care about these things at all. They realistically understand their vote doesn't change things. Probably many people don't really think of it that way because our civics classes are bent on teaching us the wrong thing. Your vote matters, and all sorts of silly examples I'm sure that they give in that class, none of which would be convincing if you spent more than a moment thinking about them. However, it's not just rational to be ignorant. It is rational to be irrational in this particular sense, right? In a market, if you were wrong about a belief, if you were wrong, just outright wrong about a belief, what happens? You will pay the cost. You will pay the full cost of that error, right? If I am making cowboy boots and I believe it is cheaper to ship leather from Colombia than it is to get it from South Texas, and I'm wrong, then my costs will be high, my competitors will outcompete me, I will be out of business. If I'm an individual and I'm under the belief that eating French fries is better for my health than eating broccoli, I will pay the cost if that turns out to be wrong. Politics, there's no cost. There's just no cost to being wrong. Doesn't matter how erroneous my beliefs are. I can believe that shutting off trade with Mexico is good for the United States, which is impossibly wrong, right? Every economist will tell you this is wrong, this is bad, it's stupid, harmful to the economy. My belief that that is true rather than false has no bearing on the policy of the United States as an individual, right? If many people believe this, which is what I'm about to talk about, if many people believe this, it becomes a problem for the country. But my individual holding of that event doesn't matter, of that belief doesn't matter. The problem is, and I'm going to focus on economics here, but this is true about all manner of things, obviously, is that in regards to economics, beliefs are not randomly wrong. They are systematically biased. They're systematically wrong. So what I want to end this lecture with is just a quick discussion of the four most common biases, four most common ways that voters are wrong about economics and erroneously vote and believe and probably influence other people to vote. Okay, so those biases are first the anti-market bias. So simply put, the economic benefits of markets are underestimated. We see lots of bad. This is a whole class in and of itself. And if you had a good principles class, especially principles micro, but even principles macro, you should have gotten a strong dose of why markets are important, why they matter, and how they benefit everyone. One of the ways that we make this error, though, is we evaluate the motives of people. But markets are beautiful in that way. It doesn't matter what your motive is. Everybody's motive is fundamentally selfish. We have to provide for ourselves. We're not so interested in the consumer. But in order to get ahead, in order to succeed, in order to have all the benefits that we want to have from doing business with people, we have to make other people better off. So it's fundamentally wrong to question the motive. Say, these people are selling this thing, they're greedy, they just want to get your money. We question their motive. Well, in the marketplace, this is inaccurate, an unuseful way to evaluate market activity. Second is we think of market activity as transfers. We think of market activity as transfers. We think this is a transfer of wealth from one person to another. That is not at all what a market is doing, right? A market is not a transfer. It is a transaction. It's not a gift from one person to another. It is not an extraction. It is not a tax. None of those things that are transfers, right? It is not that we taxed it from one person and gave it to another person in welfare spending. It is not that we stole it from anyone. It is a transaction. And so a transaction happens when I believe the thing that I'm getting is more valuable to me than the money that I'm giving up to get it. It is mutually beneficial. Second bias is an anti-foreign bias. Simply put, this is the idea that the economic benefits of trading with foreigners are underestimated. This probably is rooted in a long train of human history. Xenophobia is probably good at many times in history when the world had more violence in it. And so as a consequence, we dramatically underestimate the benefits of trading with other people. It is extremely valuable to trade with other people. It does not matter, or in fact, in the ways that it would matter would be good ways. It does not matter who those people are, right? And so we end up with benefit from trading with people across state lines. Texas benefits from trading with people into Mexico. It's also across even county or city lines. Amarillo benefits from trading with Dallas, Texas. But it's also between people in the United States. Notice that I'm not saying the United States trading with China. It's people in the United States trading with people in China. Because states don't trade with states. People trade with people, right? So the economic benefits of trading with foreigners are based on a fundamental idea in economics called specialization and trade. When we trade with more people, we can focus on narrower and narrower tasks and get better at that. We can specialize in things. It's why I'm a PhD economist. It's why you're taking this class as a way to become an accountant or get a finance degree and work in business. It's why people that aren't in this university are doing very important specialized tasks, plumbing, truck driving, maybe working in medical school, all sorts of important things. The more people you trade with, the more benefit you can get. Trade is mutually beneficial. This is true between you and your grocer, as well as it is between you and somebody that's making products in China, right? So specialization in trade, there's a big bias against trade, right? We hear things about the trade deficit, so on and so forth. This is a major error in the way that people think about economics. Next is a make work bias. This is the idea that the economic benefits of conserving labor are underestimated. It just needs to be said, labor is a cost. You know this. You know this because the work that you do, you only do for money. You don't do it for fun. Those things that you do for fun, you call hobbies, right? And even if you work for yourself, you still know that the harder you work, the more cost that is to you. One of our big lessons from macroeconomics is that productivity is wealth. Making more out of less by becoming more technologically efficient, having higher levels of education, and trading with more people allows to produce more with less, and this is fundamentally what drives wealth. This is fundamentally what drives wealth. A good example of this is when people vote for politicians. Politicians always promise to make jobs. And I'm not saying that that is necessarily fundamentally a problem. We might want to see a situation where we have thriving economy, but that needs to be done not by doing arbitrary things that cause us to work more, but by increasing our productivity, which is actually producing more with less. Another good example of this is people's hatred of robots. As irrational as that is, being forced out of work by a robot is a big fear of everyone, and yet robots are a quintessential way for us to produce more with less. Finally, pessimism, and this is the overestimating severity of economic problems and underestimating past, present, and future economic performance. It's just not as bad as we think it is, and we're doing better historically and currently and in the future than we think we are. There are many reasons for this that are sort of beyond the scope of a public choice class. Hopefully you had a good principles macroeconomic class that covered all these things, but at the end of the day, it tends to be the case that voters are biased against markets, against trade with other countries. They are biased for making jobs, and they are biased towards pessimism, all of which lead us to systematic errors in the way that we vote.